I love meeting people. I love watching people eat my food. I find that quite a privilege to cook for people and just to watch the joy in them eating it.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. We've talked about career changes quite a bit over the last few years. Those moving sideways in the food industry, those leaving it, those chancing their arm on a career in food. The pandemic forced people to think differently, try new things and look for another means to make an income. What's that transformation like, to leave a career and delve into a life in food? Sue Barclay is the owner of Piccolo Deli in Mount Victoria. Sue, how are you?
Very well, Huck, and thank you very much for having me as part of your podcast.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. You've had a fascinating transition at a strange period in our lives, changing careers into the food industry. What triggered that change?
As you know, I had a career formerly in academia, but I think deep down I'd always wanted to have my own business, and I'd always wanted to be have a cafe. You know, it's like the pipe dream, isn't it? Something you always wanted to do. And I reached all my goals that I'd wanted in my previous career, and an opportunity came up to get a little cafe in the village where I live. So I thought it was perfect timing. But of course, I didn't see what was on the horizon.
Well, it's a beautiful little building that you have the cafe in, and you took over the cafe in 2020, just before the pandemic landed. Take us back to that period of time. What was it like having changed careers and then a pandemic lands?
For the first 2 weeks in the cafe, it was great. And, you know, there was rumblings of the pandemic overseas, but we kept being assured everything was safe and fine. So we had originally intended to take over the cafe in November 2019, but due to, delays in the process of buying the cafe, and then of course the bushfires, which were the village and surrounding areas were quite heavily impacted, things got delayed. So of course by March we finally managed to get the keys to the cafe and take over the business. So we had 2 weeks, which you could say was a honeymoon period of settling in, finding my feet with the business, and then all of a sudden we had the lockdowns. So we went from trading 5 days a week to wondering what on earth we were going to do. But in a lot of ways it was quite positive, because it allowed us to change the way the cafe was going to be operated very quickly. But what it also allowed me to do was get to meet the locals without the stress of running a business at full kilt all the time. So I think after the initial shock, I decided there had to be some positives with the business that would come out of it.
Tell us about those changes that you were able to implement to build the sort of business that you wanted to have there.
Okay, well, we were allowed, obviously, because of the fact we had to become a takeaway business very quickly. And that allowed me to have time to change the menu gradually, and also to take things off. I mean, being one of two cafes at that stage in a very small village, I was very much aware when I took over that I wasn't going to be able to make any significant changes quickly, that I was going to have to work with the locals and gradually change things. So because with the pandemic, we went to takeaway, and then also I had to reduce the hours of the cafe because there wasn't the passing trade. But this allowed me to simplify the menu right down that had been offered by the previous owner. So we could take off things like, just ham and cheese croissants, because we couldn't get access to fresh croissants as quickly and easily, and they weren't moving. It allowed me to have more time, I think, to actually become more confident in baking my own cakes as well. So I was allowed to change from buying cakes being brought in, as they were previously, to actually making my own cakes, and also getting confidence making coffee. I had done all the courses. I'd had a couple of weeks working in the cafe before we took over, but to get that confidence of churning out coffee one after the other without the pressure of a line coming out the door was very useful.
I want to explore what you've created there, and particularly with the baking side of things and becoming part of the community since then. But take us back to when you were young. What sort of role did food play in your family?
It's very important in my family. I grew up in the UK. And my nana was the most amazing cook. She lived in a little tiny terrace house in Lancashire. She had virtually no kitchen. She had no fridge. And she used to cook the most amazing roast dinners. Every meal was a feast of just very simple home-cooked food out of this tiny little alcove of a kitchen. And, of course, every meal came with a compulsory pile of bread and butter on the side. But I always remember sitting down to just amazingly simple roast dinners and beautiful trifles. In fact, I've never been able to replicate my nana's trifles. And my mother was also a superb cook. She grew up in a farm in Lincolnshire. She was very much into cooking primary ingredients. And she could make food stretch. You know, she'd cook a roast on a Sunday, it'd be braised what was left on a Monday or a Tuesday, and by Wednesday what was left again would be turned into little rissoles. But there was no waste, and everything was always with primary ingredients. And I think that's where my love of food as a child, just very simple home cooking, but done well and done without any waste whatsoever, has always been important to me with food. And one of the things I do remember of like being a light bulb moment with food as a child, my father went to work in Spain and we used to go across for holidays to visit him. And I remember being exposed to tapas and this amazing explosion of flavours beyond, which was very simple food at home, beautiful food, but then this change of flavours and tasting olive oil and balsamic vinegar and beautiful marinated olives and things for the first time. When I was about 10 or 11 was quite amazing.
What led to a move to Australia?
My father came to work in Australia when I was in my teens. He was part of putting a tunnel and tracks and electrification of railways into the Blue Mountains. So it's quite ironic. Eventually, I've ended up living near where he used to work in the 1970s.
Briefly at the top of the show, we mentioned that you had a huge career change. Tell us a bit about your career as an academic.
Well, I went into academia when my children started school. Before that, I'd been in banking, and I'd always loved art and history. So when my youngest child went to school, I went to university and did a degree in art history. That led to an honours and then eventually into a PhD. And then eventually I ended up working for the University of Western Sydney, tutoring and then lecturing and being involved in, developing a passion for learning, but also teaching some of the new teachers coming through into the system as well later on. But it allowed me to meet different people from a huge range of different backgrounds and explore my love of art and history to a level I never thought possible.
Well, you are a doctor of philosophy. How have your learnings and understandings, have they helped with what you're doing now?
I think they have in a lot of ways. I think it's made me realise, especially with the philosophical approach to food, it doesn't have to be complicated, but also that connection that food has to memory and to history and family, I think is very important. I mean, one of the things that amazes me in the cafe, if I cook a Victoria sponge and people just talk about when they had that as a child or the connection to their grandmother or connection to family events around a simple cake. So I think food with the smell and the texture and the history behind a particular dish is incredibly powerful as a form of memory for people.
You mentioned you always wanted to have your own business and a cafe was a dream. When did you start thinking about that idea of having your own cafe?
I think it probably started in my early 20s. I was, doing the backpacker thing and travelling through Europe. And I worked in a pub in England for about 8-9 months and used to help out in the bar, but also in the kitchen. And then I went to Italy working in a ski resort for a while, and I was working in the kitchen there as well. And I think I realised that eventually this is something I would really like to do, just to be able to bake my own food, to serve people and to be involved in the customer service side of it, and just try and create something very simple, but something that reflects me as a person.
Was it a hard decision to make, that sort of transformation? Tell us about that period of time when you decided you were going to bite the bullet and jump into the hospitality sector.
I think it took a lot of the initial decision when I realised that the cafe was up for sale was, oh gosh, yes, I've got to do this, and it's something I really need to do. Then thankfully I have a very logical and objective partner who said, okay, let's sit down and think about this now. Write down the pros and cons, give me a business plan, do a budget, how are you going to support yourself? You've got to take a drop in wages, you're going to have to employ staff. Think of the actual logistics of doing this, giving up, a job which has a guaranteed income to one which is always going to be, it's not the most stable form of employment. So I think after a lot of paperwork, a lot of Excel spreadsheets and a lot of pros and cons, that I was very comfortable making the decision. I must admit, the first day when I walked into the cafe and took it over on my own, I did have that moment of thinking, oh, what on earth have you done? But but I think because we did so much planning before we took over the business and we put in the offer, I was very comfortable that I would be able to do it. I knew there was going to be moments of panic and I knew it was going to be a lot of hard work. But I think because of a lot of very careful planning enforced on me, the decision when it was made wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And I think it was at that time in my life I wanted that career change.
What surprised you about running a cafe?
Surprised me a lot about it was, I knew it would be hard work. I was quite surprised how much making coffee all day takes a physical toll on your body. I must admit I wasn't prepared for the aching shoulders quite as much. But also what has surprised me is how wonderful it can be just to sit and talk to somebody over a cup of coffee, and how also what has amazed me is how your brain alters. You can go from remembering facts about philosophy and talking about social change and constructions to remembering an incredible number of different coffee orders, and how that connection changes. It's just because when I first started, I thought, I am never, ever going to remember people's coffee orders. But it just amazes me how your brain alters to the situation and the environment you're in. So, they're not the most deep and thoughtful things about what has surprised me, but they have surprised me that I can remember people's coffee orders.
You've had the business a couple of years now. What's it like in the connections that you formed? Do you have any stories of the connections with the community that you formed through the cafe?
Yeah, the community has been wonderful, and getting to know members of the community. I lived in the village, but because I was always commuting to work before the cafe, I didn't really know many people in the village. But just the wonderful members of the community have come in all through both lockdowns and kept me going. There's one wonderful woman, Joy, who came in during the first lockdown. All her activities had stopped because of the lockdown. She was living on her own, and she used to wear a different dress or a different jumper or a different pair of earrings every day when she came in and got dressed up, because that was the outing for the day. And that was really special to share that and be part of that. And the fact that people come in now, I know when they've had new grandchildren, I know where their holidays have been, they come and tell me. The fact that they come and, certain members of the community come take the coffee grinds to go on worm farms or share in community gardens or go in their neighbours' veggie patches. It's really lovely to know that, even the simple thing as coffee grinds can go back into the community. And it's just really lovely.
You made a bit of a name for yourself with your baking. Tell us a bit about the food offering that you have.
It's very simple. We bake our sausage rolls, and we make all our own pies now as well, and our cakes. My philosophy on cake baking is keep it simple. I'm pretty heavy-handed in the kitchen. Pastry is a bit of my nemesis. So my cakes tend to be something, I'd be no good doing a light, fluffy super light sponge. So my cakes are very much, I suppose, going back to, being English. I like a lemon drizzle cake, a seed cake, and cakes which are based on lots of butter, lots of sugar, and can stand up to my heavy-handedness. But what has amazed me about cakes is about 18 months ago, I did a carrot cake just as a bit of a retro bake theme, and I'm still making 3 to 4 carrot cakes a week, and I never thought that carrot cake would be something I'd be turning out in such vast quantities every week. So, but I like to explore with cakes too. This week I did one with polenta. The other week I did one with sage. Just exploring with different flavours, but keeping it that really nice, dense cake density to it as well.
You are situated in a small little village, but has the clientele changed as society's opened up again and people are travelling?
We've, unfortunately, Mount Victoria suffered quite heavily with COVID. The guest house across the road had to close their cafe. The vegan cafe had to close down, and has just a new cafe in its place has just reopened. So we've been fairly quiet since the second lockdown. Things are starting slowly to pick up now, but and also because of rail closures, landslides, it's been quite a rough couple of, times since the second lockdown. So with business, we've had to, again, think about altering it in many ways, reducing the number of things we do, pulling it back to quite a basic offering. But we're hoping with the cooler weather and if we possibility of snow that things might improve in the village.
Well, the Blue Mountains is an extraordinary place in Australia. Mount Victoria, there's suburbs all around. What do you love about that sort of region that you're living in?
I love, especially Mount Victoria, I love the fact that we are just on the cusp of the Blue Mountains. 2 minutes down the road from where I live, you go down into Hartley Valley. I love the clearness of the air, the bush. And I love also being up here, of course, the sense of community. They talk about small villages or small towns. You have to live there for 20 years to be normal or accepted as part of one of the community. I mean, I've been here 4 years and everybody accepts us. Everybody's very friendly, very welcoming. And I think that to me, the Blue Mountains and the bush I grew up in the country in England. I love woods, and to be so close to nature every day, I pinch myself and can't believe how lucky I am to live up here. We have kangaroos come in the garden. And even at the cafe, we had a little echidna in the back garden last year. To be surrounded by such beauty every day is a real privilege.
You've had the cafe a couple of years now. Has the experience changed you?
I think it's made me more tolerant, I hope. It's forced me to evaluate the fact that work isn't everything, that you have to take time out from time to time, which is a bit hard when your business is only 5 minutes down the road. That tempting to always just nip back. But I think too, it's allowed me to be a bit more creative. To think about food in different ways, but also realize that the simplicity of your ingredients in your food is just as important as having a dish which has multiple layers and a complexity of exotic ingredients. That I now do appreciate more and more that just basic cooking with very simple primary ingredients.
Does your menu offering change with the clientele? Do they have suggestions and wishes that affect the way that you cook in the kitchen?
Not a lot, actually. I know the locals, they prefer it if I've got to have a carrot cake. I cannot take carrot cake off the menu despite several attempts. That has to stay on the menu. I must admit, I do change the sausage rolls a bit for the weekends. I do a pork and fennel, which always sells more on the weekends than in the week. But I try and keep everything seasonal as well. I have a lovely gentleman in the village who brings me a bunch of rhubarb every fortnight. So when there's rhubarb on fresh, I cook with rhubarb. But no, people come in, and I haven't had to change much actually, which is quite interesting because I'm always open to ideas of new things to bring in, and I'm always asking the locals if, would they like this or something slightly different. But people seem to appreciate the fact the food is what it says it is. If it's a beef sausage roll, it is a beef sausage roll. And if it's a Victoria sponge, it's just a Victoria sponge, fresh cream and jam.
Well, you've had the most extraordinary transition of careers. So what do you love about what you're doing?
I love meeting people. I love watching people eat my food. I can't believe still to this day that people actually enjoy and love what I eat. I find that quite a privilege to cook for people and just to watch the joy in them eating it, but also to meet people and hear their stories. I've just, over the years, the 2 years I've been in the cafe, I've met the most incredible people. A while ago, we had a lovely gentleman come into the cafe, and he lived out the other past Dubbo, and he was going into Sydney to train to be a regional paramedic. But he'd had a career as a shearer, and he was doing this career shift. And just to hear his story was really lovely and quite a privilege to meet people. And people who came to Mount Victoria, in the 60s and the 50s, and the stories they remember when the village was almost as big as Katoomba. Is really lovely to hear those stories as well.
Well, Sue, it's lovely to hear what you've created there in Mount Victoria, and we've loved hearing your story today on Deep in the Weeds. Please keep in touch, and we'll catch up again soon.
No, thank you very much for taking an interest in it. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very, very much.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.